So let's talk about food production. Now, it was involved in food production in some way. Most people were involved in growing some of their own food. The globe is involved in farming, and in the US, it's much lower. Less than 1% of our population is involved in food production. So we're going to talk about different types of food production, starting with organic foods, producing foods organically. Now, while organic foods are widely available, the cost is much higher to produce these foods, and therefore they're more expensive than conventional foods when it's time to buy our produce. Keep in mind that organic refers specifically to the way the food is produced, where biological pest management is used as opposed to any types of chemical pesticides. Composting, manure applications, and then crop rotation is used to maintain healthy soil, water, the crops themselves, and also animals who might otherwise be negatively affected by eating foods that have been, or plants that have been treated by chemical pesticides. So the organic food production has a lot of environmental and ecological benefits. Now, in the production of organic foods, there can be no use of synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, hormones, antibiotics, sewage sludge, genetic engineering, or irradiation. Also, organic meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy products must come from animals that were allowed to graze outdoors and were fed only on organic feed. There are quite a few different reasons that consumers choose organic to pesticide intake. In order to support a healthy environment and sustainable agriculture in particular, and sometimes to improve the nutritional quality in their diets. However, research does not show any clear evidence of significant differences in the nutrient content between organic and conventionally grown produce. And I bring this up because there are certainly several valid reasons to choose organic, but I think it's important to recognize that the nutritional quality of your overall diet is likely to be unaffected by choosing organic over conventional produce in any significant way. So for anyone who's choosing organic solely for this reason, it might not be a compelling enough reason to make that change. Again, the research just does not show that significant difference. So it's something to keep in mind. Something else that is not in the text content, though, is that a lot of people find if they compare side by side conventional and organic grown foods, they prefer the taste of the organic foods. So just one other thing to consider. Pardon me. It's not known how the decrease in pesticide consumption affects health overall. Some scientists do recommend that for infants and young children whose immune systems are not as strong and may be more vulnerable, that choosing organic more often may be more important, so among this particular population. Something else to think about is which foods you might want to prioritize choosing organic in, especially if you're concerned about that pesticide intake. Again, remember, of course, that the USDA does set very strict regulations regarding how to keep our food supply safe. And as a whole, the food supply in the United States is known to be the safest in the world. But that does not mean that people want to consume pesticides in any notable levels, even if those levels have been deemed to be safe for consumption. So you might want to look at the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. These are terms used for lists of foods that are likely to be most affected by pesticides. So the Dirty Dozen would be foods that you might want to prioritize choosing organic for if this is something that matters to you, because they are most likely to be impacted by the use of pesticides, whereas the Clean 15 might be less of a concern. Next, we're going to talk about genetically modified foods. Now, a lot of people are fearful when they hear this term. Let's look at what exactly this is. Genetic engineering allows scientists to directly alter the genetic makeup of an organism. And they do this through something called recombinant DNA technology. So they're transferring genes from one organism to another that confer specific traits. And then in food, the resulting organism is known as genetically modified, or you'll see GM on the slides here. And this figure from your text shows what that looks like, just a little splice of what that looks like here in an example of a corn plant that has been genetically modified. Recognize here that this particular type of genetic modification is done to make European corn resistant to the corn borer, which is a pest that reduces production of corn. So that's how it works, and in this particular case, what the benefit is of that genetic modification. Now, genetically engineering crops have several different uses. It is to help the crops be tolerant to herbicides, to insects, different types of pests, and also to increase the nutrient content. So again, while organic production does not demonstrate any significant increases in nutritional benefits, certain types of genetically modified crops are designed specifically to provide enhanced nutrition. We're also going to talk about genetically modified animals. The FDA recently, in 2015, approved transgenic farmed Atlantic salmon as safe for human consumption. Still not being sold in the U.S. Until some labeling and other regulations are approved, but this might be something that we do see in our food supply in the future. Genetically modified animals allow for the provision of more healthful and efficiently produced food. But there is this concern still that transgenic animals could pass genes onto wild species or outcompete those wild species for food. In terms of regulation of genetically modified foods, they're regulated by the FDA, the USDA, and also the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. Remember, that's the Food and Drug Administration and the United States Department of Agriculture. The FDA has evaluated all genetically modified foods on the market and has found them safe to consume, or they would not be on the market. In 2016, Congress approved a mandatory labeling law for genetically modified foods. So that requires that they be identified with text, a symbol, or an electronic digital link, such as a QR code. We're just going to take a moment to address safety and other concerns about genetically modified foods. The one concern is the addition of allergens to genetically modified foods that previously didn't contain them. So coming in with that DNA that's been spliced in, is that going to now make those foods to essentially contaminate them with allergens, making those foods unsafe for people who might otherwise think that they would be safe for them. There's also the concern for the development of glyphosate-resistant superweeds. Potential for crossed species lines, gene flow from the modified crops to plants that were not intended to be modified during the production phase, development of beta-toxin resistant insects, loss of genetic diversity, loss of cultural heritage, insufficient regulation, potentially development of trade barriers if other countries aren't willing to accept those genetically modified foods. So certainly there are valid concerns. Some things to remember, though, about the reasons for genetically modified foods entering our food system is that they, with becoming, allowing the plants to become more resistant to predators, essentially, it allows for higher quantity of food to be produced, therefore theoretically helping to reduce food insecurity. Additionally, it allows certain types of plants to provide higher levels of vital micronutrients. And we also touched on earlier in this chapter the potential devastating effects of micronutrient deficiencies. So genetically modified foods can also help to resolve that issue. Some things to think about. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about food preservation and processing. Preservation methods extend a food's shelf life and allow us to have access to a wide variety of foods all year round, rather than only being able to access and safely eat foods that were grown locally or very recently. So we can eat foods out of season, etc. Now, some of these methods have been around for a very long time. Drying, salting, sugaring, smoking, or fermenting are all examples, but other methods are more recent. So this is everything from pasteurization and sterilization, canning, aseptic processing, even refrigeration and freezing are a type of food preservation. That's how we are able to eat those leftovers, right? Nitrogen packing, food irradiation, and food additives are all additional examples. Food irradiation is something that some people have some concerns about, but it is another strategy for extending the shelf life of food and controlling the growth of insects and pathogens, so keeping that food safe. Irradiated food is not radioactive. The beam passes through the food, and it is safe to eat, as determined by the FDA. But it does have to have this Radura symbol on it to identify it as food that has been irradiated. Now, food additives are found primarily in processed foods, and they help to keep that food nutritious and fresh, as well as safe and appealing. There are both intentional and incidental food additives. Now, intentional food additives are those that are, as the word implies, purposely added to achieve a goal, and typically longer shelf life, as well as potentially greater nutritional value and a more appealing color or flavor. Incidental food additives, on the other hand, become part of a food through cultivation, processing, packaging, the transport, or storage. And this can include pesticides or arsenic or BPA, bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disruptor, and that alters normal metabolic mechanisms, and it's associated with liver and pancreatic damage, thyroid dysfunction, as well as increased risk of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. So these unintentional or incidental food additives can be very dangerous. Here we've got a table from the textbook that explains functions as well as examples of common food additives, and these are intentional food additives on this list. We're also just going to talk briefly about synthetic versus natural additives. The first thing you want to keep in mind is that whether or not a substance is toxic depends on how it affects the body, not on whether it occurs naturally or was synthesized in a laboratory. The dosage also is typically very critical. Table salts, something as simple and common as that, can cause illness or even death if it's ingested in too large an amount. So there are many additives that could be dangerous in very large quantities, but that doesn't mean that they are unsafe for consumption in small, regulated amounts. Another thing to keep in mind is that many plants have natural toxins that are more potent than additives intentionally added to foods. So in other words, these natural products can actually be more dangerous than synthetic additives. Also, remember again that food additives are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. It requires that manufacturers test and prove safety of any new additives before they can go on the market. Some additives are exempt. These are those that are designated as prior sanctioned substances, and they're the ones on the GRAS list. You probably want to remember this acronym. It stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. So again, these are additives that have already been determined to be safe to use in our food supply. Many food producers are making foods with fewer additives because they know that some consumers prefer that and want more natural foods. So manufacturers are trying to find more ways to increase the shelf life of food, keep them safe and healthy with no or few additives. All right, we will wrap up this section of the lecture here and pick it up in the next section.